When most people think of World War II, they think of the two campaigns that it was fought in Europe against the Nazis and in the Pacific against the Japanese. Now, obviously, there were other fronts in World War II, for example, North Africa. However, what most people don't know is that there was actually a land battle that was fought on U.S. soil in World War II. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the subject of this video today from our friends at Simple History in their Strange Stories series. This was fought at the Aleutian Islands, which if you look at a map is sort of the tail off of Alaska. And yeah, let's get right into it. Remember to like, comment, subscribe. It all helps the channel very much. And let's see the only land battle ever fought on U.S. soil.
The Aleutian Islands Campaign. Attu and Kiska, territory of Alaska.
Aleutian.
The Aleutian Islands Campaign was a military campaign led by U.S. and Canadian forces on the islands of Attu and Kiska. It was the only land battle fought on U.S. soil in World War II. Apart from that, the invasion of the Kiska Island, known as Operation Cottage, is remembered as one of the most bizarre actions in the entire war. During 2 days of sweeping the island, Allied forces had more than 300 casualties, while the Japanese had none. The reason for this was that there were no Japanese soldiers to fight in the first place. In June and July 1942, the Japanese forces, led by Admiral Yamamoto, invaded the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska. The Japanese did this as a diversion from their Midway campaign, but also to prevent the Aleutians being used as a forward base for the Americans to attack Japan. Capturing the island was a relatively easy job for the Japanese forces, as it was defended by negligible forces, 10 U.S. Navy officers from an American weather station.
So, the U.S. strategy towards Japan was that of island hopping, in which the U.S. forces would hop, so to say, to different islands, trying to get closer to the Japanese homeland. The Battle of Midway is one of the most famous naval campaigns. It's one of the most important battles of World War II, specifically in the Pacific. And the American forces slowly got closer and closer to the Japanese homeland with the ultimate intent of invading the Japanese homeland. Some of the two most famous battles of this island hopping campaign, so to say, is Okinawa and Iwo Jima, where the famous photo is taken of the 7 or 8 American soldiers raising the flag. Whole history behind that one, so I won't get into it. And ultimately, the U.S. did not, as I'm sure you know, did not have to invade the Japanese homeland due to the dropping of the 2 nuclear bombs on Japan's soil.
As soon as they took control of the islands, the Japanese started building airfields and fortification systems in the inland mountains.
Interesting.
They even brought in 500 civilians to build new military bases, tunnels, and harbors. Since the Americans were fighting Japan primarily for the domination over the Pacific Ocean, there was no doubt for them that the islands had to be liberated as soon as possible. There was also another reason why the United States was so eager to get its territory back. Kiska and Attu were the first pieces of American territory to be conquered since the War of 1812 with the United Kingdom.
Really?
Their repatriation was therefore a matter of national pride as well. The islands were under the protection of the Alaska Defense Command, or ADC, which only had 24,000 members. The U.S. Army didn't waste its time and immediately started building up its troops in Alaska for the upcoming invasion. By autumn 1942, the size of the ADC had increased to over 94,000. The first target was the island of Attu. Attu was of secondary importance compared with Kiska, which had a fully developed harbor, an operational airfield, and a larger garrison. However, by aiming to conquer Attu first, the U.S. Army wanted to cut the Japanese communication with Kiska.
Makes sense.
Operation.
Fascinating. So the fact that how quickly Japan had actually established bases here, I actually didn't know that about Attu and Kiska, that there was actually a fully functioning harbor there. I wonder, these islands today, maybe you guys can let me know in the comments how these islands sort of, what they do to this day. But still, you have to think of how fast of an operation that this was done, that they were immediately starting to build bunkers and air bases. Really fascinating.
Land crab. After almost a year of occupation.
Also, I love the names of operations. Land crab, just Fantastic.
Navy ships carrying the 17th Infantry Regiment of the 7th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army approached Attu on May 11, 1943. Landing on the island went unopposed, which gave American soldiers a false impression that it was going to be an easy task for them. The Japanese had intentionally withdrawn from the coast to prepared fortifications and bunkers in the inland mountains. They used the natural defenses as well, such as the caves and crevices.
So this was a strategy that was actually done multiple times by the Japanese army to sort of lure that false sense of security and then attack, which is obviously a very powerful tactic, not only because you surprise your enemy by sort of catching him off guard, but also the psychological components of that, of thinking, oh, where are they, and really putting your enemy on edge.
Over there, they showed a fierce resistance to American troops, fighting to the very end. After 19 days of battle, only 28 Japanese soldiers out of 2,630 of the 301st Infantry Battalion survived. The Americans
28?
also suffered enormous casualties.
Wow. So, more than 2,700 casualties in a few days.
3,829 men out of 16,000 engaged.
Oh my God.
Many of these were due
Brutal.
to unsuitable equipment, which led to the soldiers getting frostbite and other medical conditions. On top of this, many of the soldiers had never seen active combat. The Attu experience was horrifying for the American soldiers and largely influenced what happened on Kiska a few months later. Operation Cottage. Aerial reconnaissance of Kiska recorded a whole system of fortifications similar to those on Attu. Besides, intelligence estimated that they were to expect around 10,000 Japanese soldiers. Everything was indicating that Kiska was to be the next Attu. However, in late July, reconnaissance planes recorded reduced Japanese activity on the island. There was almost no anti-aircraft fire, no movements in the harbor, and destroyed buildings were not repaired. Even radio communications were missing. The radio signals stopped entirely on July 28th. However, the signals of something being very wrong were ignored by Vice Admiral Kincaid. This might have been because the Americans had the events of Attu fresh on their minds. During July, the U.S. Air Force and Navy had conducted severe bombings and shellings of the island, leading some officers to think that this may have forced the Japanese to leave the island. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, who was in charge of the entire operation, had a different impression. He thought that the Japanese had withdrawn to their labyrinth of tunnels and trenches inland, as they did on Attu.
Yep.
For him, there was no doubt that the Americans would have to fight bitterly for the island. For the liberation of Kiska, the U.S. Army engaged more than 34,000 soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division,
soldiers. Wow.
including the 17th Infantry Regiment, the 53rd Infantry Regiment, the 184th Infantry Regiment, the 4th Infantry Regiment, the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, and the 1st Special Service Force. Except for the 1st Special Service Force, this force consisted of young and inexperienced soldiers. For most, this was their first combat experience. For the invasion of Kiska, U.S. forces were reinforced by 5,300 Canadians of the 13th Royal Canadian Infantry Brigade, codenamed the Green Light Force. This unit included the Winnipeg Grenadiers, the Rocky Mountain Rangers, the Canadian Fusiliers, and other smaller formations.
So for those who might not know, I'm a Canadian Army reservist. Have been for, about 10 years now. I'm going on 10 years. And a lot of the reserve units that are serving in Ontario actually can trace their history back to World War II. For example, the Royal Regiment of Canada and the Royal Canadian Regiment. The RCR is the regular force, and the Royal Regiment of Canada is the reserve force. And I believe, I might be incorrect, but I believe the Canadian Fusiliers are still existing in some shape or form to this day. So it's kind of cool that people that are in these units, I'm not a part of them, and I'm not going to say which specific unit I'm a part of, but people that are in these units can actually trace their history back. For example, my great-grandfather, he was in World War I. He was a part of the Gordon Highlanders, and that sort of sister unit is the 48th Highlanders that are in Toronto to this day. So kind of cool that some of these regiments are older than Canada themselves, for example. So it's kind of cool.
Mountain Rangers, the Canadian Fusiliers, and other smaller formations. On August 15, 1943, American troops began their landing operation on the middle part of the island, coming from the north. Their entire operation went badly from the start, as ships carrying tanks became stranded because of poor tide
God, I'd be
calculations.
terrified. Oof.
Stranded ships then caused a traffic jam, causing a great delay. Luckily for the Allied forces, their landing was unopposed, as there was no Japanese resistance. However, this didn't
You'd
give
have
the
that
American
tension.
soldiers any peace of mind.
Yeah.
They were well aware that they were in the same situation as their comrades were on Attu. Dense fog and extremely cold winds increased the feeling of anxiety and disorientation. On August 16th, American soldiers began moving inland. On the same day, northwest from their positions, the Canadians began their landing operation.
Oh
As
no.
both contingents were moving slowly through dense fog and cold rain, they found no Japanese resistance. All they could find
those
were
20
abandoned
casualties come
positions
from-
and an unusual discovery: one dog named Explosion that used to belong to the American soldiers who were captured by Japanese Marines in the initial landings a year ago. At the same time, the American and Canadian troops were suffering casualties. Talk spread amongst the troops that there were Japanese snipers and soldiers around, which created a sense of panic. Many of them
Oh no, they
bumped
shot
into
themselves,
Japanese
didn't
minefields
they?
and booby traps, which were very difficult to notice because of the fog that reduced visibility to less than a few feet. The destroyer, Abner Reed, struck a mine when entering the harbor on Kiska, killing 70 sailors and wounding 47. But adding greatly to the disaster was when many of the killed and wounded soldiers were victims of sporadic friendly fire. As soon as troops landed, they spread out through the thick fog. On August 16th, a Canadian soldier mistakenly fired on American soldiers, believing they were Japanese. It caused a friendly fire shootout that resulted in 28 Americans and 4 Canadians killed. Around 50 men were wounded on either side. Inexperienced soldiers were terrified by the stories of the Attu carnage and disoriented by the harsh weather conditions and poor visibility caused by the fog.
Yeah, and friendly fire is something that usually isn't talked too often about, but it happens. I mean, it still happens to this day. The one example that I can think of off the top of my head, and I don't remember the name off the top of my head right now, but he was supposed to be an NFLer that decided to join the U.S. Army, and I think he was in the Special Forces, and he was actually killed by friendly fire in Iraq. And the U.S. government tried to cover this up, however, they ultimately failed in it. And so, I mean, I think even in Afghanistan, there were friendly fire incidents that still happen, that still did happen up to this day. And it's something that I wonder just how many casualties in the past, 10, 15 years or so are as a result of friendly fire. It's really a shame.
Ryan Murphy, a U.S. Army lieutenant who was at Kiska during the ordeal, later recalled that the troops were shooting at anything that moved.
Yeah.
One infantryman attacked what he thought was an enemy patrol, and despite patrol members shouting at him to stop, he proceeded to throw grenades. He was then immediately shot by friendly fire. They had anticipated a surprise Japanese attack at any moment. With their nerves on edge, these young soldiers fired upon the slightest suspicion of enemy presence. After 3 days of patrolling the island, American and Canadian soldiers finally realized that there was no enemy to fight, as the Japanese had already left Kiska. After the Second World War had ended, it became known, through interrogations, that the decision to retreat from Kiska was made after the Battle of Attu back in May. Japanese soldiers
Really?
were also frightened by the Attu scenario, and were additionally aware that any resistance was pointless. In a situation when the Japanese army was desperately in need for soldiers, they were allowed to return to posts closer to home.
Fascinating.
Back on July 28th, they were carried by several cruisers and destroyers. 5,000 Japanese soldiers had broken through the American naval blockade. They did it with the help of the thick fog. Operation Cottage was met with condemnation in the American press.
And so you have to think, too, that since they abandoned the second island, really it was a success, right? You have to think of the amount of, the amount of men that were there, the tens of thousands of men that were there, right? As well as the planning hours, the resources, the logistics that went into this, and not to mention the casualties that were ultimately suffered. So in the end, it was almost still a success for the Japanese, which is really quite something to think about, I guess, that even though they retreated, you can still consider it a success.
Even though the islands were liberated from the enemy. 92 killed in action and 221
92.
wounded soldiers was a lot to take in
Shame.
for a battle with no enemy present. Lessons
Yeah.
were learned from Operation Cottage, and the disastrous landing operations proved to be a good drill for similar campaigns until the end of the war.
Fascinating. Cool. Well, there you go. There's a little bit of, is there anything else here? I think it's just credits, no? Okay, it's literally just a blank. Alrighty. Anyways, cool video. Now you know that there was actually a land battle in North America during World War II, and I'm sure that this will help you in some manner, in some bar trivia that comes up during your life. Thank you very much for joining me. Hope you liked it. Thank you. And I will see you guys. Oh, if you haven't done so yet, remember to like, comment, subscribe. All helps the channel. I'm trying to make it to 1,000 subscribers right now. We're 30% of the way there, and I can only thank you guys for that. So, until the next video, take care. Bye-bye. Oh, and I hit the wrong thing. You know what? I'm just going to leave it in.